Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a video today looking at 3 examples of the US Department of Defense Guide to Vietnam. Now these were produced for issue to troops heading to Vietnam, both obviously originally in an advisory role and later in obviously combat role as US ground forces began to be deployed en masse. So from that point of view they're quite interesting. The booklet was simplified as time went on, and the original, the first version we're going to look at here dates from 1962, and then we run through to the 1970s with the 3 different versions. We'll have a look at the dates of introduction for these as well, when the later 2 superseded first the original, and then the last one supersedes the second version. So that's what we're going to look at in some detail here. We won't be looking at these page by page because that would take far too long. We'll have a flick through and look at some salient points, some of the photographs and so forth, the illustrations, and sort of focus on how these differ in terms of the contents. So that's what we're going to look at in some detail now. So here we have the 3 pocket guides to Vietnam, which we're going to talk about. These are the US produced guide to Vietnam. Of course, Australian military forces had their own, for example. But these are lovely things to collect, quite colourful, and they have quite a bit of information in them pertinent to the sort of the views of the war at the time, the official views anyway, and the sort of information obviously that was provided to GIs who were going over there on the proviso they actually read the pocket guide, of course. And these harken back to those used during the Second World War for the various different theatres. During the Second World War, obviously had the guide to Italy, guide to France, etc. I'm not sure if these were produced for Korea. They may have been. I've not actually looked into that, but if so, that might be a nice thing to pick up going forward as well. And what we basically have here is the 1962 edition through 1966, when it was replaced with this example, and then this example here, which I believe comes in the 70s. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of the dates when these were introduced, but we'll look at that as we flick through these. The contents don't change markedly. Between these 2, there's a sort of the guide is produced in a cheaper form in the second version, with having a stapled spine rather than a proper little bound booklet as we have here with the first example, probably because of the sheer number of these that needed to be produced as the US presence in Vietnam ramped up in 1966 through 67. Obviously starting in 65, but the big expansion really took place in 66, 67 to bring up US troop numbers in country. So the first example here, we have nice illustrations of the armies of the Republic of Vietnam at the time, certainly rank officers and other ranks, service dress there, as you can see. And at the back here, I think it does Navy and Air Force. So you have the Navy uniforms of the Republic of Vietnam and the Air Force uniforms on the back there, showing rank insignia and the sort of service uniform again, as I say. Within this, I'll have a quick flick through, look at the contents and so forth. Obviously you can see here published by the Armed Forces Information and Education Department of Defence, of course, and we have the title page there, some nice illustrations, and then the contents list here, which obviously you can pause here and read this if you wish to in more detail, but we have the designation of this pamphlet at the top here as well, which gives the Department of Defence number there, the pamphlet number and so forth there, as you can see. But there's quite a bit of information presented in these, and as you can see there's quite the range of topics covered. But we'll definitely have a look at the language guide at 114 at some point, but we'll have a quick flick through some of this. The illustrations are nice, the photographs from the time, of course. It talks about produce from the country, culture, history, etc., as you can see. We'll just keep flicking through. I'm not going to go through these ad nauseum, but talk a little bit about what you find in these. Otherwise the video would be very long if we were going through page by page. But you can see provinces and districts, a little bit on the geography, and the obviously the armed forces are covered here as well, but the geography and the administration of the country, legal status in Vietnam, of course, very important. Quite an important thing to understand if you're sort of a Vietnam War reenactor. I think if you want to talk to people, it's quite an interesting point to raise. Obviously we have a map there with various road signs, which is quite important, particularly for, well, in general really, but particularly for those troops involved in transport and so forth, of course. I'm sure they would be briefed in greater detail, but those troops who were involved directly in transportation and so forth on the highway network in Vietnam. But you do have this basic guide here within the booklet, which is interesting. I think the other books are a little bit more stripped down to some degree in the terms of the details they go into, but religion and so forth is covered here as well, of course. And population, schools, education, music and theatre and so forth. There's really tried to condense down the culture and the details, some of the nitty-gritty of the country, obviously produce and politics and culture and everything all in one little book. So quite the task, really. The various, you can see here, particular towns noted at the back here. And then, if we skip to 114, there is a language guide, which gives you a sort of guide to pronunciation, which is quite interesting, and obviously notes the significant differences between the different dialects and pronunciations and so forth across the country, which is typical. And we understand that in our own countries, of course, there's quite the variations in terms of dialect and accent in various countries, of course. And obviously I'll flick through these pages so you can pause and read if you wish to. I think the light's not causing too much glare there. You should be able to read these okay. And then the useful phrases section we'll get into here is quite interesting as well. Questions and answers, also very useful. I think military ranks particularly important as well, of course. And that's the end of the book there, as you can see. Signed off by Robert McNamara, as you can see there. And this is 6 December 1962, which is obviously when this was sort of signed off. You'll see here, in the second version, 1966, we actually have, if we skip through, we have again the Army uniforms on the front there, on the inside of the front cover, and the Navy and Air Force at the back again. If we skip past the cover, the title page, which uses the same illustration as we saw before, we get into the start of the book 9 Rules for Personnel of US Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which is quite an important starting point, of course. If we skip a little bit further ahead to the contents page, you can see this supersedes DoD PG 21 of 6 December 1962. So when this comes out in 1966, it supersedes the previous document, and you'll see here the original designation was DoD PG 21. We're now on to DoD PG 21A-21A. And this is dated 1966. If we flick to the back again to look for the same, there we go, Secretary of Defence, the statement from the Secretary of Defence, or the approval of this by the Secretary of Defence, 5th of April 1966 is when this version appeared. And as I say, this has much the same contents you can see at the back here, but it is shorter. We're down to 91 pages, as you can see there, or slightly more than that, 94 at the end here, so fewer pages. And you can see we do have the language section at the back here, but that's shorter. The language section is somewhat shorter. And if we look through this, the contents page, if we compare the two contents pages here, you'll see the difference, or some of the difference in these. So we've lost the full government and armed forces section there. The country, obviously 2 to 9 there rather than 2 to 15, a new republic, so that's been reduced down. Yeah, you can see that they have condensed this somewhat. It's been simplified compared to the original 1962 version. But we again have some interesting photographs of obviously the map of the Republic of Vietnam there, as you can see. Simplified version thereof. You don't have all the traffic signs and everything, but we do have more illustrations in this, interestingly, more photographs. Interesting Arvin River Patrol there, of course, before the large US presence on the rivers of South Vietnam of the Republic of Vietnam really ramped up. So definitely more photographs in this, which is interesting, but less, certainly less content, written content than we saw in the previous version. It's not just that it's been condensed in size, as you can see, sections have been removed or some of that information has probably been condensed into the other sections to get as much of the information across as possible, but it's certainly been simplified compared to the 1962 version. And then we move on to this example here, which is DoD PG-21B. So we've gone from 21A to 21B. So this is the further follow-up version. And as we'll see here again, we have the uniforms at the front there. I'm not sure if they have changed. The rank structure did change a little bit over time, I think, in terms of insignia. Yes, so you've got the Master Sergeant and First Class and Master Sergeant insignia added on there, for example, and the change in the shoulder boards for officers as well, illustrated there, which is interesting. And same, we've got the Navy and the Air Force uniforms at the back here, sadly slightly damaged there, but there it is. And you'll see different different illustration on the title page there, but this pamphlet supersedes DoD PG-21A of April 5th, 1966. So this replaces the 1966 version, being 21B. And if we go to the back here, I think we again have the this particular one is the US government printed off in 1971, so that's when this was printed. Don't remember, I'll have to check if we have yes, we don't have that page at the back of the approval, but this particular example was printed in 1971. So my presumption is this is either introduced in 1971 or this particular example was introduced in very late 60s, early 70s, and this example of it was printed in 1971. So if anyone can actually clarify that, I'd be interested to know. I have had a look through this and not been able to sort of discern an introduction date. Again, we'll compare the contents page again actually. So this has changed somewhat again. Obviously, we've already seen you've got recommended reading and a notes section at the back there. If we pick up the contents page here, so that's, as you can see, has changed quite considerably. So opportunity to serve has disappeared. We jump straight into the Republic of Vietnam, guide for your conduct, freedom's long road, which is indicative of the situation at the time. A bit of ancient history, a bit of modern history. So that's actually been sort of split off into the two sections there, which obviously talks more about the 2,000 years of history, I guess, in the first one, and the modern history is the war to date, the French War, and then the war to date and so forth. A government of law, you and the law in Vietnam, a rich and fertile land, meet your Vietnamese hosts. So again, you've got more sort of, in terms of introduction to the people of Vietnam in this section here, which is perhaps slightly more of a focus in this version. Bugs and bugaboos, United States Forces in Vietnam, a nation fight. United States Forces in Vietnam, bugs and bugaboos, some useful information. Vietnamese language guide is still there, of course, and recommended reading. So recommended further reading, which is interesting. And we'll have a look at that section. We'll have a quick flip through the photos again, because again, there are another interesting selection of photos in here, obviously updated with, the service of US Force in Vietnam. It gives lots of opportunity for further photographs, as you can see, from taken during US involvement in Vietnam. Flick through. And we will flick further to the back in a moment and have a look at that recommended reading. Again, we have a slightly modified map there compared to that we saw in the 1966 version. For the militiamen, I think possibly the popular force there, obviously with Second War era weaponry, of course, as the militia in the Republic of Vietnam. They were armed with them right the way through towards the end. Militia forces, that is. Obviously the ARVN began to get updated, up-to-date US-made weaponry during Vietnamization, of course. So United States Forces in Vietnam, the other war, which is the Hearts and Minds, of course. You can see lots of photographs here are taken during US involvement, of course, which was not the case with the earlier versions for obvious reasons. And then flick here, language guide, which is slightly differently, laid out slightly differently here, as you can see, but still included. And then we have recommended reading, which is quite interesting. So we'll pause here to have a look at. You have minority groups in the Republic of Vietnam, US Government Printing Office, to give you a greater understanding of the indigenous tribes and so forth. The Smaller Dragon, A Political History of Vietnam is an interesting one to think of, being recommended. Vietnam Diary, from 1963. Know Your Enemy, the Viet Cong, which is another Department of Defense pamphlet, as you can see there, or document anyway, book. So quite an interesting selection of books there and recommended reading. And we'll just flick further on here. I think there may be more. No, that's it. Here we go. So, there you go, November 20th, 1970. So I've missed that previously, flicking through. Blooming big font to miss as well, but there we are, November 20th, 1970. So this was printed in 71, but introduced in November 20, 1970. The 20th of November, 1970. So there we are. That answers that question. And something I'll be honest, I've not flicked through this in any great detail since I bought this particular example. I've looked at both the others in quite a lot of detail. So nice that we've sort of discovered that together in this video. There we are, November 20th, 1970. And then you have interesting little thing about earning 10% on your savings while you're serving in the Republic of Vietnam. Uniformed Services Saving Deposit Program. So that's quite interesting that that's sort of advertised here. And then a notes section, which has been left blank. Whoever this was issued to, if it was issued, has not used this. But it's possible this has just been, I don't know the wear and tear, where that's come from, obviously, but I don't know if this was ever issued or not. Probably not, given the relative overall good condition it's in. That's all run to over 15 minutes. I think this will be an over 15-minute video looking at the timer on the camera. And we did only have a brief look through these, a brief flick through these. But if you collect US Vietnam kit, I highly recommend looking out for an example of each of these. I believe this is the last publication in 1970. Obviously, the Vietnamization was in full swing by that point, and US ground troops would not be involved for all that much longer in Vietnam, of course. You only have a couple of years, really. So, well, from the end of 1970, not even that long. So, as I say, I think this is the last publication, and this is the set of 3 that you see throughout the involvement of US, significant numbers of US ground forces in Vietnam. So nice to have, and a little bit of a timeline there in terms of the topics covered, the photographs used, and so forth. So there it is. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at these. As I say, not a massively in-depth look at each one. We've only looked at a few pages from each, obviously, focusing on photographs and so forth. But hopefully this has shown you the way these changed over time, a little bit of the difference in the contents there, obviously comparing the contents pages. Of the 3, I would say the 1966 version, the middle of the 3, is the easiest to find. These are readily available on eBay and various other places for not a great deal of money. They're quite cheap, really, for what they are. They contain quite a bit of information. I'd imagine that's probably the example that was printed in the greatest numbers. Of the other 2, I've actually found the 1962 example the easiest to find. The 1970s version is, I think, the hardest, or certainly in my experience, it's been the hardest, which is odd. I would say probably it was printed in the second greatest numbers compared to the 1966 version, potentially. I don't know that for sure, but it was the one I found most difficult to find. The 1962 example was the second easiest to find of the 3. But from a collecting point of view, they're very interesting to get your hands on and have a look through. And if you do collect Vietnam War US kit and ephemera, etc., I would suggest that looking out for these is a good idea. They're nice additions to the collection, and they have a lot of interesting information in them. Not only on sort of the changing nature of the war, but obviously you see the change in the illustrations and the photographs used, and a little bit of a change in the tone of the information provided and the details of the information provided as well. So interesting historically from that point of view too. That's everything for the video. Hopefully it has been interesting looking through these. If you found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Whether you're new to subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. But as I say, that's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.